It is a time again to be taught. What is it? It's Wednesday, Edge of the Sword Ministries, Adapt International Calvary Chapel, Rancho Santa Margarita. We have my brother Robert, better known as Bubbaloo. We have Craig and Caleb here, your servant Tom. We're here to talk about the craziness that God would talk to Paul to answer the questions that the church of Corinth had. And what we're really excited about is those exact same questions are being asked today. 2,000 years later, the church has got the same questions. The church has got the same issues, and we're trying to figure them out. So we're going to take a look at what the questions are, and we're going to look at what the Spirit of God told Paul to say about those questions, and we're going to see if they apply to your life. So here we go. It's a good evening. What time is it? I don't know. It's evening sometime. 5:09 p.m. on a Wednesday, Pacific Standard Time, just so you know where we're at. Yeah. And so we've got about an hour to look at. We're going to start, these 7 questions that the church had for Paul, and we're going to take a look at them one at a time. We might for sure not get through all 7. That's what I think.
So the first one you gave us was in 1 Corinthians 7:1.
Hold on. We got Leo in the house. I forgot about Leo. What up, Leo? The newest member of the podcast team, Leo Peerless. This is the man. Okay, now we're on. Yeah, hey, Leo, you the man. Okay, so back to the questions. What are we doing now?
1 Corinthians 7:1 was the first question.
7:1.
So 7:1 says, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control."
Well, there's a lot going on there. So the question was, basically, how is marriage working? Should I be single? Should I get married? If I get married, how does that work? What does intimacy in marriage look like? What are your duties there? I mean, that's a funny way to talk about intimacy, right? But what are your duties? What are your responsibilities inside that marriage?
Kind of summarize it by, what about marriage in the new covenant?
Okay. So that's very good. I like that because it hits even the single people thinking about marriage and the people that are already in marriage, right? So that's a good. Because
I think there were 3 sub questions I found going down to verse 12, which we haven't gotten yet, but I found in verse 1 we've got, should I get married? And Paul says it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And then I found in verse 10 it's can I get divorced? But to the married I give instructions, and talks about divorce. And then in verse 12, what if I'm married to a non-believer? And so it seems like there's a lot of aspects of marriage that he's hitting, but it's now from the new covenant perspective.
Yeah, that's good. So let's take the first question. So questions on marriage, really the question is about marriage, and then there's some sub-questions. So what's the first one?
So the big question is, what about marriage in the new covenant? The first question I had was, should I get married?
Wow. So, should you get married? I guess what's interesting in the text is Paul says, I think it says, I really need to bust out a Bible. Would be a good thing to have. But I think he says, I say not the Lord. Is that context?
5. He says in verse 8, but I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. That's not what we're looking for. Okay. Verse 10.
Verse
but
10,
to the married, I give instructions. Not I, but the Lord.
So he kind of says what I was trying to catch, just so we go into it, knowing that we're in 1 Corinthians, right?
Yep. 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah. And so he kind of says, hey, this is my opinion, or this is my idea. And he doesn't really, he kind of like pulls it away. Like, I didn't hear this from the Lord, but here's what I think, right? He says, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immorality, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. Now, so that's interesting. Now, concerning things about which I wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. He's saying, hey, if you can stay single, that actually gives you some blessing. Right? Yep. And he goes into that at a later date, talking about if you marry, you want to please your wife. If you're not married, you're able to just focus on pleasing the Lord. And then in verse 2, he says, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. So he's saying the problem with staying single is it tends to lead to immorality. It tends to lead to fornication. It tends to lead to sexual sin, right? And so he says, and each woman is to have her own husband. Verse 3, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Here's the interesting thing. I hear people quote that, but the rest of it's important. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now, what is he talking about there? Verse 5 kind of brings it into focus, right? He says, stop depriving one another except by agreement. So he's talking about sexual intimacy, marital intimacy, right? And he's saying, this is a big problem, right? If we're not engaged, if we're not intimate with each other in a marriage, then what happens is we start to have difficulty, we start to have strife, we start to have problems. And he said, and really what he's saying is, once you're married, it isn't about what I want, it's about what my spouse wants. It isn't about what I need, it's about what my spouse needs. And so that's a beautiful way of looking at a marriage contract, a one flesh contract. It's that I come into marriage with every intention of meeting and my wife's needs and blessing my wife in every way that I can, right? And vice versa, my wife with me. And if you have that, you have a pretty incredible basis for marriage, right?
I think it's interesting because when we think about that from the perspective of Jesus, because Paul later, I don't know if it's in this letter, but he talks about how, it's in Ephesians where he says, wives submit to husbands. But he says, I'm speaking of a mystery, I'm speaking of Christ and the church. And you think about how Jesus came to meet the needs of the woman he wanted to have be his bride. But then in response to what Jesus has done for us, we should do everything we can to meet what Jesus desires, which is that everybody would come in, we would live holy lives for him, with him, and bring others into it. And it's just, I just love how he's always modeling everything for us.
Well, that's great. Yeah. So that whole idea of Christ pursuing the church as a bride, right? And that idea, that's good. So the kind of the first summary is what then? You should get married. Would you say that?
I think I would say you should get married under certain conditions. What do you think, Kev?
He says, because there's so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife. And I'm thinking when he wrote this, and it's to the church in Corinth, which is probably very similar to the way times are today. So I think, yes, he's leaning for men to get married, especially if their lusts get a little bit away from them.
I think that's right. And he is saying in some ways, if you have the gift of singleness and you're good, right, then that has its advantages, and in some ways it's even better, right?
Well, and I think, and this may be a separate question, but I think I highlighted some stuff that I think helps with that, which is verses 17, 24, and 26, where he says, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk, and so I direct in all the churches. And that's verse 17. Verse 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in the condition which he was called. Verse 26, I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is a good for a man to remain as he is. And there's a context surrounding each of those verses, but there seems to be this repetitive theme later in the text about what condition were you in when you were first called into Christ? And don't be so hasty to get out of that condition. Don't be so quick to remove yourself from singleness or marriage or whatever condition you're in.
Do you think Paul there is talking from a perspective of the imminent return of Christ, of his estimation that the world as he knew it was towards the end of it, and that he expected the rapture, or he expected the return of Christ? It seems to me that's what he's talking about. I in my reading, I would say that he's talking about that from the sense of, he said, even those are married. Later at another place, I think it's Thessalonians. Even those that are married should act like they're not married, right? And I'm like, even those that are married should act like they're not married. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
And the thought seems to be that there's like, don't get over focused on even family relationships. Now he's saying, hey, be responsible, be in love, be intimate, but make sure you keep Christ the principal thing, right? And I think that we can find in lots of cultures where marriage becomes the principal thing, right?
It's interesting, and so we were talking about in the podcast with Megan a couple days ago, so go check it out if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
We were talking
Spiritual warfare in the younger
generation, 2 Timothy, I think it was 2 Timothy. And we talked about do not get entangled in civilian affairs. And that kind of rings in my head right now, that when Paul's saying the married should act as if they're not married, don't get too caught up in family relations.
Yeah.
It comes back
Stay
to
alert.
Stay alert. I mean, you
be ready for battle.
Don't get too focused on what your wife wants, because you're in a battle, and it's just that he wants us out of those entanglements.
See, it finds me funny because I'm married, and my wife gets orders for the Middle East and in a war zone, and I'm mad. I've been married 6 months, right? I'm not a Christian at the time. I've been married 6 months. My wife gets orders for the Middle East, and I'm like, I go see the first sergeant. I'm like, dude, just got married. He's like, yeah, it's the United States Army, son. They call them orders for a reason. I was like, oh. So I guess there's no conversation here. There's no negotiation. There's no like, hey, I just got married. None of that work. He's like, I think the only thing he did say is, you could volunteer to go be in the same theater. So that's what I did. That's how I ended up in Istanbul. Is I just like, might as well be close. So I volunteered to go. But yeah, so under orders, and focused on the battle. And that's the funniest thing is when you're in a combat zone, family don't take precedence. Guess what takes the precedence? The battle. Wow.
What are your thoughts on that, Kev?
I was thinking about, if you're in a battle, your priority is still the Lord, right?
Yeah, for sure. It probably more so than anything else, right? Because when you go into combat, right, what are you doing? The general's got your wholehearted attention, or the king in that case.
Well, and I couldn't imagine having to go to battle without the Lord.
Whoo.
Sheesh. Or take this, that so not recognizing that you're in a battle, but living as if you're not in a battle, but you're in a war zone. I mean, so imagine being on D-Day. Imagine like being there on D-Day, and you've got like, you're just like sitting there drinking cereal as bullets are flying, and you're talking with your wife about, well, what's your day like, honey? And there's just people dying around you, bombs going off, and you're just like, well, I think later today it'd be good if we went for a walk. And there's like, and just bombs are going on.
You know what's funny though is it gets like that. You adapt to the sense where what seems crazy when you get there later is, you see these guys, they've been there for 2 tours, 3 tours, and they're walking around and the bullets are flying and you're like hiding in a rock, right? And they're like, dude, what are you doing? We got to work. It's things to do here. And I'm like, dude, they're firing at us. And so I think take that home a little bit to South Orange County 2024. Sometimes the battle's in the middle of my marriage. Spiritual warfare really is about dividing and conquering.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the first line of battle is unity with my wife, unity with my kids, right? I'm trying to not lose that. And the enemy is attacking. That's the real attack of the enemy, right? Is to divide the relationships, divide you from the people at church, divide you from your pastoral staff, divide you from the people that you're discipling or that are discipling you, divide your family up in such a way that there is no unity and there is no togetherness in Christ, right? I'm thinking about how you're working on reforming that in your walk, Kevin. Is that so? I know for us, our work has been to the real truth is this: is as we went to the mission field for 27 years, we were not around as much as we would like to have been, and so find ourselves needing to overemphasize trying to get together with the kids. I mean, just really going out of our way to try to be there with the kids, right? And so, and there's a price to pay, right? And sometimes I'm tired, sometimes I don't understand, sometimes there's stress, difficulties. What I like, by the grace of God, our kids are great. Like we go hang out and it's good. It's just chill. It's not ever really anything, difficult. But I think, man, we're working to try to have a better relationship inside the family. I know you've been thinking about Sabbath a lot. Caleb, what tell me a little about that and your family thing.
So it started with a conversation we had in the jacuzzi.
Oh yeah.
And then, so what God's got us on this crazy schedule right now. There's just a lot going on. I get concerned, like, am I not spending enough time with my family, with my wife? But we've both prayed about it. I have an amazing wife, and she's been like, well, can you point to something that God isn't specifically calling you to do right now? And I'm like, no, I can't. But the Lord got us on this idea of, just because Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And the Jerusalem Council did not reaffirm Sabbath as something that had to be kept.
Right.
And yet we see in Timothy that all scripture is God breathed and is good for, it's correction, instruction, rebuke, and training up in righteousness. So that would mean that the laws around Sabbath have a wisdom for us. And I think what Jesus was saying is, hey, God created humanity to rest. And he made sure that was clear to you because he rested himself. And then he created a whole day just so you could rest. So what my family's been doing, and God's really gotten us into, is Saturday is our Sabbath. And we don't go anywhere. We don't do anything. We try to keep our phones off. My wife, for her, it's super restorative to like go for a run. So she goes for a run. I get in the Word. We spend some time. Last week, at the end of the day, she pulled out the guitar and she was playing worship songs. And we usually play like a board game at some point, but it's time where it's a whole day just for family. It's a whole day where we don't have anything going on. We don't have any responsibilities other than to connect with God and connect with each other and connect with this little guy.
Do you, quick question here, do you guys look at the word rest as a noun or as like a verb? So in other words, is rest a place that you go and you're in rest, or is
I think
rest,
it's something you do.
So you think it's
a verb. I think it's a verb.
I think also Hebrews says, there's still a Sabbath rest. Let us strive to enter into
That's right.
rest.
Well, there's a physical rest and a spiritual rest too.
Yep. And that's right. I think that's right, Bubba. I think that idea, God beat me up about it for years. You don't know how to rest. But I was taking a Sabbath. I had a Monday off, and we fought to keep that. And it was a big, important thing in our whole entire life. I'm working to get back to that. I'm not there right now. But I think the idea of rest is the fullness of faith. And so if you're anxious, you're not resting, right?
Yep.
If you're fearful, you're not resting, right? If you're worried, you're not resting. If you're depressed, you're not resting. And so rest is the intentional state of trusting God in a continual way, in moment to moment, day by day. And I don't walk in that all the time. It's like walking in the Spirit. I don't walk in that all the time either. But my intention is to rest in the Lord, right?
So rest doesn't necessarily need to be a dedicated time on like a Sabbath that we're honoring. It could be in our daily life. We're resting in the Lord regardless of what's going on. So we're at peace in stormy conditions. We're walking, we're walking in the Spirit. We're at ease.
So every day would be the Sabbath.
Well, so my question though is,
so I think that's common thought.
Yeah.
And I think there's some verses that you could use to kind of go along with that thought. I think that if in an agricultural society there was a need to pull away with family and pull away with your marriage, or just pull away you and the guys and sit still and read and worship and pray. That's what I mean. It's interesting what the rules of the Sabbath were. You couldn't walk too far.
As a matter of fact,
couldn't cook.
In Exodus, on the seventh day, there was a seventh day, and the people went out to collect manna, and there was none. And God spoke to them and said, I gave you a double portion on the sixth day, so that you wouldn't have to go anywhere on the Sabbath day. Do not leave where you are.
So there was this kind of it kind of goes along with the thought of be still and know that I am God.
Yeah.
It's kind of, so I think the real rest is the idea that I think it's hilarious that Chick-fil-A is closed on Sunday. But I think it's that idea. It's that idea that we're going to do what God said and trust what God gives us. And we're not going to go, because the truth be told, if you're in South Orange County, you're working 7 days a week, and it's hard not to be working 7 days a week. And if you're not working, you're running.
And you're doing something else too. Like even in the church, that's one of the things we try to do is we're really careful about making sure that, and this is just the way we feel led to do it. Even, the the ministry my wife and I have is really a lot about prayer. And so one of the things we try to be careful with on our Sabbath is there's a lot of times where we're coming to the Lord and saying, hey, we want to pray for this person or that situation, or do this or do that. And we really try to be even more careful with prayer to be like, okay, Lord, if there's something you want done today, just like when Jesus would go to the synagogue, it seems like he didn't go there with the intention of healing somebody, but then there was a guy there. And then somebody showed up. And then when he responds to the Pharisees, he says, but if your oxen or your son falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, you're going to go get him, right? And so he seems like he's referencing these circumstances where your aim was to not pull something out of a ditch on the Sabbath, but then it happened. And so that's where for us, it's a lot about, like you said, it's trusting that everything else is going to get taken care of. Ministry is going to get taken care of. Work's going to get taken care of. And we can step away from all of that to just be with the Lord for a day. And I think there's one other piece too, for me at least, is that I wonder, and I wouldn't be dogmatic in any way about this, but we hear about this concept of burnout, and people talk about burnout and people getting burned out, and I'm getting burned out. And I wonder if there's not just a spiritual component, but a physical component to it. That did God design humanity? Did he design us not to run 24/7? Did he design us so that we would stop and physically let ourselves rest and physically get away from the labors and the burdens and the anxiety and the struggle? And because in the desert, they were told you can't leave your tent. You got to stay physically where you're at. And if there's wisdom in that, then what is the wisdom? That's the question my wife and I have been asking. What is the wisdom of Sabbath? What is the teaching of Sabbath? What is the correction of Sabbath? What is the rebuke of Sabbath? What is the training in righteousness of the Sabbath laws that we should be carrying forward and not denying simply on the basis that we aren't to judge one another on the basis of new moons or Sabbaths, or because the Jerusalem Council didn't carry it forward, or because we see Jesus doing certain activities on the Sabbath?
Well, so I hear you, and it's funny because I'm very pro a day off. When I hear the Sabbath, I think legal. And I think the biggest key is that it's not legal.
No.
And so it's not Sabbath law. It's not Old Testament Sabbath.
Yep.
It's the idea that there must have been a good reason for that thought.
Yes.
And the same Father that's in love with me and sent his son to die for me, when he was judging the world and leading the world from a legal government, said, hey, you guys need to take a rest, which is weird, right? What world is the boss worried about you taking a rest, right? And so here it is. Now I'm with my Father. I'm in the family of God. I'm a son of God. I'm hanging out with my brothers and sisters. And he's saying, and you guys need to hang out together.
Yep.
You guys need to kick it together. You need to spend time together. You need to not go do anything. You can't not clean up the church, not go cut the lawn, not go and evangelize. You need to just sit down and enjoy me together. That's the Sabbath in my mind. It's hang out with the Lord together, and try it. In the way we would do it is try to stay off anything electronic, anything that absorbs your attention, pulls you away, anything that sucks you in, and try to stay focused on each other and on the Lord, and then that's it. And I think as we get busier, man, that's a big blessing. That idea that we get time to hang out with the Lord is a big blessing.
And just
why don't we go back to the beginning now? Like,
yeah.
and, okay, Genesis. So you get the 10 Commandments.
Uh-huh.
God stated, honor the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And what happens is all these rules afterwards. That's man-made, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
there's some of it there in the Torah, but yeah.
Okay,
but certainly they added to it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And just to clarify, when I talked about the law, just for especially for anybody listening, it's the idea from Timothy that there's something to learn. So we are not under that law anymore. There is something to learn from it. And my concern becomes that I think there's a dismissiveness of much of what's in the Old Testament on the basis that, well, we're not under that covenant anymore, so I don't have to follow those laws. But that would mean, but if Timothy's saying that all scripture is God breathed, then it's good for instruction, rebuke, correction, training, and righteousness. That would mean that all of the law in the Old Testament, I don't need to follow it. Like, I'm sure this is.
I think you do need to follow it. So I think it's such a touchy subject because each term is important.
Yes.
I think
follow in the sense from a legal perspective.
Right. There's no legal consequence, no legal contract.
Yes.
No legal, no law relationship.
But like you said, if God said, let's take one of the laws that's not related to Sabbath, don't wear clothes of two different thread. I've got some stuff that's polyester and cotton at home. But what was God's intention behind that? Why even give that as a law? What's the wisdom behind it? What's the wisdom behind
You know what's
that
funny
stuff?
that you bring that up, because I was reading something and it was blowing my mind. So there's some frequency that different fabrics actually give off, and they affect your body frequencies. They were doing this thing, and I couldn't give you a good understanding of it, but they were showing that when the two different fabrics that you weren't supposed to put together, it was cotton and wool or cotton and something else. I don't remember what it was, but if you put the two together, they cancel each other out, and there's no frequency. And so either one is okay by itself, but if you put the two together, and I don't know what that, they're coming with a lot of science about the idea that life is basically, modulation of frequency, that the body that's not alive has no frequency and the body that is alive does, and a lot of that. But I thought that was so interesting that even the clothing stuff in the Bible that you're thinking, what is that about?
Well, the wool is from an animal, and the cotton's from the earth, and those are the tares.
Mm-hmm. And so they cancel each other out, and I know nothing about that, but it was a really interesting conversation. I think the funniest thing I think is as we learn more and more, and science opens up deeper and deeper, it proves the word of God more and more, right? I mean, it's crazy how much it's continuously proving the word of God.
We were talking about Sabbath because we were talking about family on the basis of should I get married, and so we said a lot. Kev, you're quiet over there. But you always come in with these good.
He's on the research. You leave him alone.
Yeah.
I'm on the research, and it brought me to a couple places. I think I kind of want to circle back to what Bob Lou said about physical rest and spiritual rest.
Okay.
I think those are they're two different things, right? I mean, I think they each lead into each other. If you're resting physically, it gives you that time to kind of focus in spiritually to the Lord. And if you're focusing spiritually to the Lord, I think naturally our bodies tend to be more at ease. I was looking at Psalm 127, and it says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep." Which I found interesting, so that while we're sleeping, I think what this psalm is kind of saying is that the Lord is going to feed us. The Lord is going to give us this rest that we're looking for.
It's interesting. I love the verse. The verse is great and deep. I'm just not sure it has so much to do with rest. I think what it's saying is you can labor and labor and labor and labor and labor and labor, and unless God's in the middle of it, you're not going to prosper. You can guard and watch and be alert and guard the wall, but if God's not protecting the city, you're getting overran. No matter how much you guard, no matter how much you alert, no matter how many weapons you have. And kind of the sense behind it is, you can wear yourself out working and trying to get ahead. Man, I've seen that in my own life, and then you could just go, well, I'm going to do my time, and I'm going to take my rest, and I'm going to take my day off, and I'm going to spend time with my wife. And as my mom used to say, I'm going to smell the roses. And he's saying God's going to prosper you. What he's saying is the real chance to get ahead, or real prosperity, or real security comes more from trusting in God than all you're doing. It mixes the two together in a nice way, and it says you got to be doing. He's not saying he's going to bless you if you do nothing. He's not saying he's going to protect you if you're not alert. But he is saying you can be as alert as you want to be and not be protected, and you can be as hardworking as you want to be and not prosper. The key is to walk, serve, fight, battle, minister, marriage, parent in the Lord, right? Because the prosperity comes in the koinonia unity when you work together with God. That's the process.
That would be keeping our thoughts captive.
Keeping our thoughts captive, keeping him in front, hearing his voice, being governed by him, going where he tells me, listening to what he tells me, asking for counsel. You know what? I've had several bad days this week. And this morning on the way into work, I was talking to the Lord, and I said, we're going to pray. I have not prayed because Kevin's not with me, and it's his fault. And so, because Kevin's one of them great guys that goes, let's pray before we get started, guys. And I love that. So here I had to be Kevin this morning. We walked right into work, and I said, hey guys, let's pray before we get started. Give us wisdom, Lord, lead us, show us the way, prosper our labors. And he did it. And I'm going to tell you, exactly what you're saying, Kev, that verse is what I experienced today. I had days where Tom goes in and Tom's going to knock it out and I got a punch list and I'm going to handle it. And the day goes to heck. And today I went in and I said, well, I don't got it handled. Anything could happen. I'm gonna seek you first. And all of a sudden the day progresses and is very prosperous. It's exactly what that verse is saying. I think, if we'll do it with the Lord, if we'll keep him more important than my labor, more important than my battling, because I think we get in a spiritual battle and fight too much. I think my wife struggles with that a little bit. Don't tell her though. I think
we won't tell her, neither will all our listeners.
Don't tell her because I might get in trouble. But she sometimes doesn't know how to rest. She prayer warrior. This girl is craziness. But sometimes I think you just need. One of the things that I'm praying for in my marriage, if you're out there listening, pray for me, is just that we would rest as a marriage in the midst of his glory. And that, we can serve 6 days a week, bell to bell, I don't mind. But that there would be a day where we just said, wow, it's about me and you and Jesus and me and you and me and you and Jesus and me and you. And I don't get a lot of that. We ministry, work, needs, people dying of cancer. There's a million needs.
And that comes back to the rest you were talking about, which is there's a million needs, but the Psalm says he'll give to his beloved even in his sleep. Oh yeah. So it's like even at the point where you are the least productive in the entirety of your day, which would be while you're sleeping, God will still give to you then. And if he'll give to you then while you're sleeping, how much more if we'll just walk with him, rest with him, guard with him. I think about the guarding piece, right? Yeah. There's the story, I don't remember the dude's name, but the enemies of Israel are attacking them and the whole Israelite army flees except this one dude. And he's in a field of peas, a field of lentils. And he kills like 300 Philistines. And he fights so long and so hard that his hand freezes to his sword.
Felt like that with the steering wheel in the car this morning.
Right. and you wonder, like, I want to sit down with that guy and be like, so what was what was going on in your heart? What was going on with you and God? What was your faith as you walked in? Was he a Caleb that's like, 300 Philistines, God's with me, who cares? Like, what was going on that afterward that you won this great victory? Because the Lord had to have been with him. There's no way you kill 300 guys unless the Lord's with you. And it's like, what can you do on the job site?
You think about it now. You might have some hand grenades, some some automatic weapons, kill 300 people. But if you're doing it with a sword, life is rocking. You are not joking around if you're killing 300 guys with a sword.
And then if we come back to getting married, it's like, I wonder if that's part of why Paul is like, hey man, think about getting married first, because it's, I know in our culture, marriage is so romanticized. It's just like, if you're single, you must be lonely and you must be alone. And it's a sad, sad world if you're alone. My friends and I actually used to call Valentine's Day Singles Awareness Day. So the acronym is SAD. And so that's what we used to call Valentine's Day. And
see, you should not send your kids to college.
That's a whole nother podcast. And,
society today doesn't promote marriage anymore.
Well, but
it's almost anti-marriage at this point, right?
No, just relationships. And short terms.
And then the thing is then it's romanticizing it, right? So it's the short term stuff and it's all the romantic aspects of it. But then nobody sits down and tells you. I remember my wife and I had this conversation once. We just gotten in a fight that was totally my fault, 100% my fault. And she was like, "Man, this marriage thing is difficult." And I was like, "Babe, we promised each other for better or for worse. And this is the for worse part." And she just goes, "Bummer." But there was no prep. Like I'm thankful that I've been around people like yourself and others who have said, "Hey, just remember, marriage is tough. Marriage is warfare. Marriage is a battle, and it's not against your spouse. It's against an enemy, and it's two becoming one flesh, and that's not easy." I think Paul is wanting to exhort people and here to just to be like, "Hey, if you can avoid all that and just focus on Jesus, it'd be way better for you."
Just like having a child, marriage is a training ground, learning how to develop your relationship. And a child, as being a dad, Caleb, that you're learning things as a father.
It's a very interesting. For everybody. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think of a young gal who's in England, and she was running Calvary Distribution, and then she went to England as a missionary, and single gal. And she's killing it, right? She's got her ministry is just amazing. She's super happy. She's writing a book. She's invested in ministry. She's just doing great. I think if God calls you to that, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
You know, and then I think
She's
there's
single?
a single gal, not a young gal either. She's getting up there. But I'll tell you, for me,
Yeah.
I needed a wife, and
Same here.
My wife is the best thing after Jesus that ever happened to me, and that doesn't mean it's all easy for sure, but I got a partner, and it's almost bad because she's such my partner that I don't even think about it that she's my partner sometimes. Like what I mean is, she's like the sure thing. She's like, I know when I come home, she's there. I know she's praying. I know she's taking care of everything in the background. I know she's on alert. I know I'm not even thinking about it sometimes because it's just so constant and steady. And my life is so blessed by that constancy and that steadiness and who she is in Christ. And then she's got a little more experience than me. So she just brings a lot. I don't know how she puts up with me. We'll say that.
It's super interesting you say that because it just made me think of where we opened up in Corinthians 7:1. Right? My thought was, Paul says, get married. In so many words, due to so much sexual immorality, get married.
That's right.
Yeah. Yep.
But what you just described, the beauty of your marriage, is so much more than just the sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
So I guess it kind of makes me wonder is I guess the ability to grow in all those areas that you just mentioned with Naomi is the beauty.
Yeah.
Is the beauty of marriage, and that's the maturity and the growth.
I think it's also
Jesus. And I think that the idea is for me as a single man, when I think about marriage, at this point in my life, it's not so much for me about the sexual intimacy, but of course that's there. But it's more about the finding the right woman to marry, so you can have the sure thing.
Oh yeah, a virtuous wife. Who can find one? For her worth is far above rubies. Right? Yeah, amen. Here's the thing. As a guy that does a lot of marriage counseling. We do probably less marriage counseling than lots of people because we do discipleship more than we do counseling, right? But so I would say really more it's in the discipleship time when I'm with a marriage, you start to realize, man, when I first got to South Orange County, I thought I had a terrible marriage. I asked the pastor, I said, listen, help me. My marriage ain't like everybody else. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, so-and-so. I mean, he's like, dude, I got them in marriage counseling. Believe me, your marriage is better than them. And I laughed at that. What's better than them? I don't even know what that means. But I think that it's easy to have the appearance.
Yes.
And the baby and my bride and my beloved. And what really happens when you're, alone is so often different. And when you're discipling a marriage together, a couple together, that stuff, because when we do discipleship here, we do it 3 hours at a time, once a week, usually for a year. And so you get to know people, man, and people just like third month in, they're like, blah, they're just telling you everything. Right. And you start, and I was encouraged by that. I wasn't discouraged. I was encouraged because almost all marriages are hard. I haven't met an easy marriage yet. Right. And so marriage is difficult and it's hard, and yet it's fruitful if you lock into it over the long run, right? If you stay consistent and you stay committed, it's still not easy. It's still hard, but it certainly is life-changing. It's life-transforming. The fact that I'm bound to you and you're bound to me makes us one in a way that, and it makes us rub and sharpen each other. And my wife, she'll tell me, you need to go brush your teeth, or you need to go put some mouthwash in, or you need to get some Chiclets, or you better get some mint. And my first response to that, I was so offended by that thing. It's like, what are you doing? What's on your mind? She says, ain't nobody else going to tell you, but everybody's going to smell it. And I was like, wow. Let me think about that.
Brutal honesty.
That brutal honesty.
Yes.
But you don't get that, right? You could be with your buddy, and he might say, dude, sit over there a little bit further away, but he won't just tell you, dude, your breath stinks. You need a mint, And I think spouses, man, it's
sometimes when you're true with your wife,
you're
honest with her.
Yeah.
She doesn't want to hear the honesty.
Oh, you know what's funny?
I tell her, I says, a lot of times people say comments to you, and they're being polite. That's all they are, is being polite. And I take it with a grain of salt. So
Yeah. I think the funny thing, if in my marriage, we're both married to Asians. I pray for you a lot. And you know, it's such an interesting culture. And so but I think that if I look at my marriage, I'm the vast majority of the time trying to lead my wife into a place of peace and rest and comfort, and I don't always do that, but that would be my goal, right?
Yes.
And trying to tell me the truth, right? But you know what's interesting is as I started, we're working in a problem in Mexico in the ministry, and I was on a phone on a speaker hearing this disciplinary process and confrontational process, and there were a guy and a girl involved. So the guy went first, and the guys were all merciful and kind, and yes, telling the truth, but gentle. And then the girls were brutal to themselves. I mean, the girls with the girls, right? I was like, wow, dude. I think I texted in, but nobody picked up my phone. I was like, I think if I'd have been there, I'd have been like, yo, y'all need to stop. You guys are just too hard on each other. You're just going for broke, you know? And I think that sometimes I see my wife is hard on herself.
You find sometimes that the wife will try to usurp your authority.
Oh, that's every day.
And you try to.
I mean, she wouldn't say that, but I mean, it is in a gentle way. But I mean, that's not my wife's fault. That's the curse, right?
Yep.
So that's actually part of the curse is that, right?
And appreciate that she tells you that. Go brush your teeth.
It hurts like heck on occasions, you know. Does it bring forth fruit and good time? Yes. I think it does. I'm looking at myself needing to shave right here just to talk about it, since you can all see it. I would get in trouble if my wife knew I was on. She'd be like, "Look, you're a pastor. You need to get a razor. You need to square yourself away." I need that because my brain's on a million things, and let me tell you, it's not about shaving until I'm in a camera and I'm thinking, "Oh my goodness, I didn't shave." And a million other things, spiritual things, holiness things, prayerfulness, putting God's for it, and all those things are a blessing. But it's a battle, you know, and it's, I think the biggest part of marriage is this, that if I could knuckle down, the simplest thing you can do to make your marriage great, it's stop trying to change your spouse.
Yes.
And just pray that God would change them, and work on changing everything you can about you as a husband or wife, whatever you are, right? Stop worrying about how they speak to you, tone of voice, attitude, usurp authority, like, don't like, serve, don't serve, even intimacy or no intimacy. Just dump all that and go, I'm going to make sure that I'm available, that I listen, that I serve, that I pray, that I lead, that I'm gentle, that I'm kind. And when the conflict happens, I'm going to do what's right regardless of my spouse's response.
I had a great night where that happened once, and I was just being mean to my spouse. I was just, and it was like repetitive, and I would come back and I'd apologize, and I was just being verbally mean again. And she was just nice to me the whole time. At one point, she's making me dinner, and the whole time she's like, are you struggling with this? Are you struggling with that? Is this? And then she goes, you know what I think it is? You're hard on yourself, so you're being hard on me. And I love it. And it stopped me dead in my tracks. I almost started crying.
See, you and Naomi get along so good because you're like that. You're a perfectionist and you're hard on yourself.
Yeah, but I needed someone who was going to love me that way, but speak truth, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about, is like, she kept sticking with me, and she wasn't getting caught up in how I was treating her. She was caught up in, wow, this guy's obviously struggling. How do I help him? And then she got to a solution that stopped me dead in my tracks. And I mean, that's what I think what you're talking about is stop worrying about how they're treating you and start focusing on transforming yourself and loving them, helping them, encouraging them, walking with them.
Well, and I think, really in marriages, of course, but in all relationships, it takes us having, a humble approach to these relationships, because the first thing that gets in my way is pride, right? I'm going to get offended.
I'm not going to say everybody. I struggle with that too. It's so easy to be offended.
Oh yeah,
man.
and the idea of being unoffendable. I mean,
Great book, by the way.
Yeah, if you haven't read it.
What I do is those situations, I'm always asking the Lord, says, what will you have me to do? You know, where do I go from here? What am I being? I'm being tested, and I'm failing the test probably because I keep going through those trials.
what's exciting about this conversation is that it's almost it's giving I mean, the way I'm looking at this conversation is it's exciting because it's like, how do I get to improve this relationship I'm in? For me, it's not a marriage. For me, it's friends, it's family, it's parents. But it's forget about myself.
That's it.
How can I serve them?
That's it.
And when I get to do that, I've seen it. Relationships become fruitful, and God exalts the humble, and all these promises start to really bleed their way in, and it's a way of living.
Yeah, it's the reason we're alive. God, the reason we're still here is because we get a chance every day to grow and be a better dad, a better husband, a better son, a better friend, a better coworker, a better boss, right? A better brother. And that's what God's trying to, that's the whole process, that we would grow in Jesus, that we would grow in character. And really what everything that character has to do with is about interpersonal relationships, right? How are you doing when you're involved with your man, Leo, you drinking out of a cup, son. Okay, no more bottle for you.
Glory to God.
Done deal. That's some. You are going to look back at a podcast and see that's the first time I was on film drinking out of a cup, bro. People don't drink out of a cup at your age. I want you to understand. Okay, you rocking the house over there. Wave at me. That's what I'm talking about. He was waving earlier. Wow.
Hey, buddy.
Marriage. Should you get married? I guess that's a deep question. We haven't quite made it through. It's kind of coming up on the end of the hour. I think it's a good thing. Blessed my life. I wouldn't miss it. I'd go back and do it again. Hardest thing I've ever done. Best thing I've ever done except Jesus. Maybe Jesus is the hardest thing I've ever done. The second hardest thing I've ever done was being married and a blessing. Wow. Really nice to have everybody. What a good talk. The best thing I like about these nights is I have no idea where we're going. That was not at all what I thought we were going to talk about. And so what a blessing. We got to do that. Adapt International, Calvary Chapel, Rancho Santa Margarita, South Orange County, www